Later, the search would be joined by a man who already knew how it all ended. He would walk with the volunteers through dark courtyards, check apartment building entrances, ask passersby if they'd seen the missing boy, and do everything possible to look just as worried as everyone else. But that would come later. For now, there was only a phone call. On the morning of February 3, 2025, a woman called the Chernyakovsk police station and reported that her 7-year-old son, Danila Klebov, had left home the previous evening and still hadn't returned. According to her, there had been an argument at home. He was threatened with being sent to a boarding school, got upset, took 2,000 rubles from his mother's wallet, and left, not even slamming the door behind him. It was a winter night, with below-freezing temperatures outside, and only in the morning, several hours later, did she decide to call the police. This immediately raises a question that, for some reason, no one latched onto at the time. Why didn't she call sooner? But back then, no one dwelled on it. They took her statement and got to work. Chernyakovsk is a small city in the east of the Kaliningrad Oblast with 35,000 residents, a quiet place right near the border. When someone goes missing in a city like that, especially in winter, especially someone so young, it immediately becomes an event for the entire community. The police began their patrols. K-9 units and patrol groups combed through courtyards and surrounding areas, checking basements, abandoned buildings, and garage complexes. Information about his disappearance spread like wildfire through local social media pages and chat groups, and ordinary residents began joining the search almost immediately. But at that moment, no one could have predicted the scale of what was to follow. Within the first 24 hours, over 6,000 people joined the newly created search coordination chat. For a city with a population of 35,000, that's 1 in every 6 residents. A real number that would later be cited in all the case files. Flyers were plastered on apartment entrances, bus stops, stores, and posts at intersections. Volunteers who had never met before broke into groups and set out to search the city from morning until late at night. Strangers knocked on doors asking the same question: "Have you seen Danila?" A missing person alert with his photo spread throughout the city. Blonde hair, a smile, first grade, 7 years old. This information was reshared thousands of times, and it quickly spread far beyond Chernyakovsk. An operational headquarters was established, comprised of authorities, police, and volunteers. People got off their work shifts, grabbed their flashlights, and went out into the darkness. The entire city was consumed by a single question: where is Danila? And among those searching were his mother and stepfather. They walked alongside the volunteers, attended meetings at the headquarters, and looked just like everyone else, lost and distraught. Just 2 more people who wanted to help. The mother and stepfather gave their statements on the record, calmly and in detail. Their version of events matched what the mother had said on the phone that morning. They decided he would come back on his own, but he didn't. The story sounded completely solid. The details were specific. The amount of money, the reason, the time, the sequence of events. Who would specify 2,000 rubles if they were lying? At that point, the investigators had no reason to doubt them. The photograph that circulated around the city created a very specific image: a lively, well-cared-for homebody, not from a dysfunctional family. Someone who was cared for and loved. At least that's how it looked from the outside. In public, Anastasia appeared downcast and spoke quietly. She answered questions in monosyllables. He walked beside her. He didn't hide, didn't stay silent. He did exactly what normal parents do when a family member goes missing. He searched. He went out with the search parties, checked addresses. He would return to the headquarters and then head out again. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should. A family in crisis, doing everything possible to bring their own back. On the afternoon of February 3rd, while the city was still combing through courtyards and basements, an investigative team entered the apartment on Komsomolskaya. Formally, it was a routine inspection of the residence as part of the search, but in reality, by that point, something already wasn't adding up. What exactly the investigators discovered inside was not disclosed in the public case files, but their next move spoke louder than any press release. The investigative committee brought in a forensic expert from St. Petersburg, not from the local department, but from the Central Forensic Support Division. This expert was flown across the country for the case of a 7-year-old who, according to his parents, had simply gotten upset and run away from home. They don't do that for a typical search. They call in canine units, step up patrols, and request camera footage. Forensic experts from another region are only brought in when they are no longer looking for a missing person, but for something else entirely. That same evening, the Kaliningrad Oblast branch of the investigative committee opened a criminal case. It wasn't opened as a search or a missing persons case. It was immediately classified under a serious charge, with a maximum penalty of up to 20 years. From the very first hours, the investigation didn't believe the runaway story, and instead of continuing to search basements and attics, investigators began to work with those who had supposedly lost him. On the evening of February 3rd, the mother and stepfather were separated into different interrogation rooms. Until then, they had stuck together the entire time, during the searches, when talking to the police, and while giving their initial statements. Now they were apart, each behind their own door, each facing their own investigator. This is where the discrepancies began. According to the acting head of the Regional Investigative Committee, Dmitry Kanonerov, the parents themselves became the primary suspects. The reason was contradictions in their testimonies. Kanonerov didn't publicly specify what exactly didn't add up, but the very phrase primary suspects spoke volumes. Not the neighbors, not random passers-by, but the very two people who had spent all day with volunteers, showing people a photograph of their son. Investigators focused on the mother, working with her for several hours straight. One interrogation after another, clarifying questions, returning to details, and checking her story against what the stepfather was saying in the next room. Later, the investigative committee would call this work competent and coordinated. Behind that dry official phrase lay hours of pressure, applied by an investigator who understood that they weren't dealing with a grief-stricken woman, but with someone who was hiding something. After midnight, in the early hours of February 4th, Anastasia broke. She told investigators that Danila's life was taken by his stepfather. There was no runaway, no stolen 2,000 rubles, no offended first grader who had walked out into the winter night. Danila never left the apartment. He couldn't have left. He had already been dead for more than a day. The entire story about the argument and the boarding school was fabricated from start to finish. The charade collapsed in less than 24 hours. While thousands of people were combing through basements, 2 investigators in quiet offices were taking apart the story that 2 adults had concocted. Anastasia named the stepfather. She said it was him, at that moment portraying herself as a victim, a woman who had been intimidated and had covered up the crime out of fear. That's how it looked that night. Next, they detained the stepfather. He confirmed her story and showed them where to look. Sergei Gama, 42, gave a confession on video. On the recording, he is calm, speaking evenly without hysterics, as if retelling someone else's story, not his own. He pointed out the location, a swampy area within the city of Chernyakovsk. Very close to the house within walking distance of the apartment on Komsomolskaya Street, the investigative team went to the site and quickly found a garbage bag inside a larger bag. Inside the bag were bricks for weight, so it wouldn't surface from the pond, the swamp, the wintry sludge. And the person who put it there had stood among the volunteers and pretended that he too was searching. The on-site verification of his testimony confirmed everything. What they found matched what he had described. But one question remained. What exactly happened in the apartment on the evening of February 1st? What caused 7-year-old Danila Treklebov not to live to see the morning? The reconstruction of that evening is based on Gama's own testimony and the findings of the investigation. Saturday, February 1st evening. The mother is not home. She's at work. In the apartment on Komsomolskaya, the stepfather remains with 2 children, 7-year-old Danila and his 12-year-old sister. Gama demands that Danila do some exercises. In his video interrogation, he speaks about it calmly, as if it were a trivial, everyday matter. Danila wasn't listening. At some point, these requests stopped being requests. Gammon inflicted multiple blows to the 7-year-old's head and torso. Not one, not two. Multiple. That's exactly what it says in the case files. This wasn't a slap or a spank. A grown man, 42 years old, against a 7-year-old who refused to do squats. What happened in the apartment after that? There's nothing in the publicly available case files. Was his sister nearby? Did she hear? Did she see? It's unknown. According to the investigation, on the morning of February 2nd, Gammon discovered that Danila was no longer breathing. An entire night passed between the beating and that moment, hours during which something could still have been done: call an ambulance, take him to the hospital. His mother was right there in the next room, but none of that happened. Danila spent that night alone with injuries incompatible with life, and no one dialed 3 numbers. Exercise. The 7-year-old didn't want to do his exercises. This is the reason Gammon gave during his interrogation. But the exercises weren't the reason, they were the pretext, the last one in a long chain. It's just that at that moment, no one knew it yet. What follows is a sequence of actions carried out by a person with a completely clear head. He puts what was left of him into a bag. He puts bricks inside. Whether he had them ready beforehand or looked for them at that moment is unknown. He carries the bag out of the apartment, walks to a marshy area within the city limits, sinks it, returns home, and cleans up the apartment. Between the first step and the last, there was time to stop. He didn't stop. Then Anastasia came home. She's 30 years old. 2 children. She had 2 children. Exactly what he said to her, word for word, is unknown, but the result is documented. She didn't call the police, didn't run to the neighbors. Instead, they sat down and started fabricating a story. An argument, the threat of a boarding school, hurt feelings, money from her wallet, and him running away. A simple, plausible version of a story that happens all the time. A detail that surfaced later. Immediately after it happened, Anastasia quit her job, not a week later. Immediately. This is the act of a person who understands that their life has changed. She needed to be home to control the situation. All day on February 2nd, and all through the night into the 3rd, Anastasia knew what had happened. She knew where her son was. She was in the same apartment he had been carried out of, and she said nothing. On the morning of February 3rd, she dialed the police. The voice of a worried mother. A coherent story with details. The police accepted her report. The city began to search, and a few hours later, both of them were standing among the volunteers. He was from a city right there in the Kaliningrad Oblast, half an hour's drive from Chernyakovsk. He had no prior criminal record, no arrests, no police registrations, no complaints. A man without a history, at least on paper. The family also looked clean. They weren't on any preventative watch lists. Neither Child Protective Services nor the Juvenile Affairs Inspectorate had any complaints against them. From the outside, it was just a normal apartment on a normal street. Exactly when he entered this family's life, there is no data in open sources. But by that February, they were an official family. A shared home, a shared life. The facade was flawless. Nothing that would make you call the local police officer. It was one of those cases where the neighbors later say, "We never would have thought. They were such a normal family." But Danila's grandmother, Anastasia's mother, knew otherwise. After everything happened, she told a journalist, "He had terrified everyone, both Nastya and the 2 children. They were all very afraid of him." She added, "I knew things were bad, but I just couldn't imagine it would come to this." She knew. She didn't just suspect. She knew they were afraid in that house, and yet she couldn't imagine it. As if there's a threshold up to which fear of a grown man is still tolerable, not yet a reason to act. But the grandmother wasn't the police, or child services, or the school. She had neither the authority nor the tools. She saw it all and hoped it would all be okay. It wasn't. The Leningradsky District Court of Kaliningrad on February 5th, just 2 days after the search began, and only 1 day after they found what the entire city had hoped they wouldn't. The Kaliningrad Oblast Prosecutor's Office supported the investigators' request for an arrest warrant. The charge was for taking the life of a child not yet 8 years old. The maximum sentence by law was 20 years. Neither the accused nor his lawyer objected. Gamma silently accepted the sentence he was given. On the surface, it might have seemed like a full confession, but it wasn't that straightforward. Gamma only partially admitted his guilt. Exactly what he disputed was never publicly disclosed by the court or the investigation. Perhaps he believed he didn't intend for that outcome. Perhaps he believed he wasn't the only one to blame. This detail was left hanging in the air. Parallel to the main case, another one was opened under a different charge, causing moderate bodily harm to a minor family member. And this is the most crucial part. It wasn't about Daniel, but about Gamma's 12-year-old stepdaughter, the sister. The result for the stepdaughter was a broken humerus, not a bruise, not a scrape that would heal in a week, but a broken bone. They never went to the hospital. The 12-year-old walked around with a broken arm for nearly 3 weeks, without a cast, without an X-ray, without painkillers. Every movement was agony, and not a single adult by her side would take her to a doctor, because a doctor means questions. It means the truth. Only on January 12th was she finally taken to the hospital. Doctors confirmed the fracture, began treatment, and asked what had happened. She answered calmly, without hesitation, that she fell down the stairs in the apartment building. This is what she had been taught to say. That's how someone who knows what will happen if they tell the truth behaves. The doctors accepted her story and treated her. On January 25th, they discharged her and sent her home, to that very house, to those very people. They didn't notify the police, didn't call inspectors. The incident was recorded, and yet it didn't seem strange. Danil wasn't the first one in that apartment. The signs were there long before February. They were in his sister's medical records. They could have been read, but no one read them. The fracture in December wasn't the first signal. It wasn't even the loudest, just the last one before the finale. After the case went public, parents whose children attended the same preschool as Daniel began to speak out. Daniel was repeatedly seen with bruises, not on his knees, not on his elbows. In places you couldn't explain away with a fall on the playground. The preschool staff called the police and the inspector for family and youth affairs. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. The report went through the proper channels, and nothing. The police arrived and questioned the mother. Anastasia refused to file a report. She said they were no longer living with the stepfather, that everything was fine, the situation was under control. The police accepted her refusal, and so did child services. Formally, everything was done by the book. Everyone was questioned. The necessary party refused to press charges. A box was checked. The file was closed. Except that after all this, Danil returned to the same apartment, to that same man, with the same kinds of marks, which reappeared after a while. Then they stopped appearing because he no longer left the house. A mother's refusal to press charges. In this system, it works like an emergency brake. She says no, and the whole machine grinds to a halt. The procedure was clear. No complaint, no case. The mother is the legal representative and she makes the call. And no one asked why a woman whose son has bruises is refusing help. What's stopping her? Fear? Dependency? Or the fact that she herself is part of this story? No one asked these questions. They only came up later, when there was no one left to answer them. The report from the preschool wasn't the only one. There was another, from Anastasia herself. Sometime last year, the exact date does not appear in the public records, Danil's mother went to the police herself and filed a report about domestic violence. The police conducted an investigation. They found no grounds to open a case. The result? Complaint dismissed. By that point, the family was already on the radar of the inspectors. The police knew the address. They knew that reports were coming from there. One from the preschool about bruises, a second from the mother herself with a complaint. 2 signals from the same apartment about the same problem, and both of them went nowhere. The family was not placed on a monitoring list, and no follow-up checks were scheduled. The inspector knew about this family, and that knowledge proved insufficient to prevent anything at all. On paper, nothing was happening. Anastasia's statement now, after the arrest and charges, looks completely different. Back then it seemed like a cry for help, but now the question is framed differently. Was it a genuine cry, or an insurance policy, a prearranged backdrop, _quote_0_, just in case everything came to light? There's no answer yet, but the question hangs in the air. Where was Danila regularly seen by other adults? School, first grade, and at some point he stopped going. Sources disagree on the dates. Some say Danila hadn't been seen since mid-December, others say since the 20th of January. But the fact is undeniable. By February 1st, he had been absent for at least a week and a half to 2 weeks, likely longer. His mother would call the teachers and say her son was sick. It's normal in the winter. No one. There was no doctor's note during this entire time. No house calls, no visits to the clinic. It was impossible to show him. He most likely had marks on him. The school accepted the explanation over the phone, and that was that. Not a single teacher came to the house to check. A first grader, 7 years old, disappeared from view, and it didn't prompt a single visit. And the school was the last line of defense. The preschool was in the past. The signal from there had been sent and drowned in procedures. The police knew the address and closed the case. The doctors treated his sister and sent her home. His grandmother knew things were bad but hoped it would all be okay. One by one, the doors closed. And right at the moment Danila stopped showing up, no one came. The last days of his life were spent behind a closed door, without school, without friends, without a single outside glance. The farewell service was held at the Cathedral of Archangel Michael, the city's main church. A line of hundreds of people with flowers, toys, and drawings formed outside the entrance. The same people who had been searching for Danila in basements 3 days earlier now stood in line to say goodbye to him. On the fresh grave, there were toys, the ones he could have played with. Someone brought a toy car, someone else a teddy bear. A first grader being buried by the entire city. His mother did not appear at the farewell. Other memorials sprang up not only in Chernyakovsk, but also in Kaliningrad on Ploshchad Pobedi. Candles, flowers, notes. One of the posters read, "Forgive us, we couldn't." The mayor of Chernyakovsk, Sergei Bulichev, addressed the citizens and did not shy away from responsibility. He said it plainly. "I believe the administration was negligent somewhere. The kindergarten, the school, the neighbors, the residents, this is our shared tragedy." This spoke louder than any words. A group of fathers came to the police station and demanded they hand over the detainee. The region's governor, Alexei Besprozvanik, wrote on the same day, "We cannot protect ourselves from hidden brutality, but we can from indifference." The phrase sounds right, but the people in Chernyakovsk already understood by then that the problem wasn't indifference. Thousands of people had gone out on a winter night to search for a stranger's first-grade son. The system was what was broken. The head of the investigative committee, Bastrikin, took the case under his personal control. In parallel, a separate investigation was launched into the negligence of the police officers who had the information, but failed to take sufficient measures. It seemed the story was coming to an end. The culprit was detained. The city was in mourning. The authorities were admitting their mistakes. But a day later, something happened that turned everything upside down. The demand was singular: to pass a law on domestic violence. In just a few days, more than 14,000 people signed the petition. First, 1 in 6 residents went out to search, then 1 in 2, maybe even more, if you count the signatures from other cities, demanded that this never happen again. But in essence, there was nothing to demand. There is no law on domestic violence in Russia. The fight to pass one has been going on for more than 10 years. In 2019, the Federation Council published a draft bill, but it never made it to the State Duma, and in 2017 the opposite happened. Assault within the family was decriminalized. The first offense ceased to be a criminal act. It now carries a fine of 5,000 to 30,000 rubles, or community service, or arrest for up to 15 days. Criminal liability only begins with a repeat offense, and only if the first one was officially recorded and brought to a decision. For someone to be charged with assault within the family, you need a statement, an investigation, a formal report, and a court decision. 4 steps. Anyone can snap. In Danila's case, every chance was cut short. Not a single incident ever made it into an official report, which means that, according to the law, there was no first offense in this family, nor a repeat one. Danila wouldn't get to a repeat incident in the legal sense, because a first one was never even logged in the system, but those who could have taken action still remained silent. On February 7th, one day after the funeral, the investigative committee arrested Anastasia, not as a witness, and not for concealment, the charge she had faced from the very beginning. A terrified wife covering for an abusive husband, an understandable, almost sympathetic position. But the new charges completely shattered that picture. Systematic use of force, endangerment, improper fulfillment of parental duties. 3 charges, and each one was about action, not silence. According to the investigation, from September 2023 to February 2024, the mother, together with the stepfather, systematically used force against both of them. Both Danila and her daughter, she deprived them of water, intimidated them, and humiliated them, day in and day out, behind the closed door of an ordinary apartment. September 2023. Danila was 5 then. He had just entered the senior group of his preschool. That's when it all began. A year and a half, this wasn't a sudden outburst. It was a routine, a way of life. Deprivation of water, that wasn't a metaphor. The 2 children weren't allowed to drink. 5 and 10 years old when it started. 7 and 12 by the time it ended. Everything anyone might have thought up to that point was turned upside down. This wasn't one tyrant and a terrified family, but 2 adults who had been doing the same thing, together, this whole time. She wasn't someone forced into silence. She was the other one. Her image as a downtrodden mother now looked completely different. Not grief, but a performance. Not confusion, but control. The investigative committee revealed the details of the charges, and the picture grew even darker. February 1st, a Saturday, the very evening that Gumma used force against Danila. Anastasia knew about it that same evening. The investigation's phrasing left no room for interpretation. She knew, and she did nothing. He was in a condition that investigators classified as life-threatening. His mother was right there, and she left him like that all night, until the morning, when it was too late for anyone to help. According to the prosecution, it was this inaction that became one of the links in the chain that led to the fatal outcome, not the only one, but the one that could have changed everything. December. Her 12-year-old daughter's broken arm. Anastasia knew. She knew he was the one who had broken it. And she didn't seek medical help. When she finally brought her daughter to the hospital, she took control. She made sure the girl would tell the right story. The stairs, the building entrance, she fell. It wasn't Gumma standing in the emergency room dictating the answers. It was her mother. She constructed the lie, made sure her daughter had memorized it, and sent her in to see the doctors. This was a system, a distribution of roles, a year and a half, 2 adults, 1 apartment, closed doors. The governor ordered that help be provided to Danila's 12-year-old sister, the only one left from this family. Now she was all alone. Mother in a pretrial detention center, stepfather there as well, brother in the cemetery. 12 years old, with not a single adult by her side who hadn't caused her harm. For the Regional Investigative Committee, this case was unprecedented. 3 parallel investigations for police negligence, systematic use of force, and infliction of bodily harm. Each one peeled back another layer. The Telegram channel for the Kaliningrad Investigative Committee Directorate doubled its followers in the 24 hours after the mother's arrest. People subscribed to make sure this case wouldn't just go quiet and be closed 6 months later. The residents of Chernyakovsk announced a fundraiser for a memorial stele, not just for Danila, but for all victims of domestic violence. They planned to install it in the park on Komsomolskaya Street, that very same street. The system worked, but it only kicked in after the fact. After it was all over, the town did everything it could. The question is, what could have been done before? 6,000 people came out on a winter night to search for Danila Treklobov, one out of every 6 residents of Chernyakovsk. They grabbed flashlights and headed into the darkness, knocking on strangers' doors. Strangers searched for a first grader they didn't know as if he were their own, because in a town of 35,000, there are no strangers. But he was already gone. He was lying in a swamp, in a bag weighted down with bricks, just a few hundred meters from his home. And the person who put him there was standing among the search party. But the true horror of this story isn't about that evening. Not the phone charger, not the beatings, and not the bag. That was just the final act. The story began a year and a half earlier. Starting in September of 2023, 2 adults subjected 2 others to what investigators would classify as systematic use of force, deprivation of water, and intimidation, every single day behind the closed door of an ordinary apartment. And all this time, warning signs were getting out. Each time they reached the right people, and each time 5 links in the chain broke. Every word was spoken exactly by the book. Not a single word more, not a single step further. But no one entered that apartment while there was still time. Stella can't be heard behind closed doors, but people can. Dear viewers, we once again ask you not to be indifferent. If you notice something wrong with your neighbors or perhaps with your classmates, please don't just stand by. Take action. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.